The gospel says that the Spirit of truth will be sent from the Father and the Son, and he will guide to all truth. He will be that advocate, that helper that will be with you always. And in the readings that we've been hearing throughout these past couple weeks from the Acts of the Apostles, we hear how St. Paul is just listening and following and being empowered by this advocate. We're seeing it actually how it's lived out in the early life of the church. And most of the time, we've seen Paul speaking to his Jewish brothers and sisters, and he's speaking about the Old Testament. He's speaking about how Jesus is the fulfillment of everything that's come. He is the Messiah. But now he finds himself in a totally different culture. He's in the middle of the great philosophical city of Athens. And during this time, it's kind of a shadow of its former days of glory. In Athens at this time, St. Paul says that he's looking around while he's waiting for Silas and Timothy to come. And he sees that the city, in Greek it says literally, it's a forest of idols. Everywhere you look, there are all these pagan idols to all the different gods, the god of the sky, of lightning, of harvest, of all these different places. And him, as someone who's worshiping the one true God, it says he's exasperated. And he's sitting there and he's like, so he goes into the marketplace and he starts talking about the God of Israel. Ultimately about Jesus. And some of the philosophers that are there, they hear about him and they say, who is this guy? And they get confused because they're hearing these names like Jesus and the resurrection, and they're even thinking that these are two different gods, a male god and a female god. They don't have a conception of understanding what he's talking about. So they grab him and they say, we want to find out what you are saying because you are giving us strange thoughts. And the way that they say that is it's not merely just an invitation to have a nice, gentle dialogue, but basically saying, just like this is the city several centuries before, that Socrates was put on the death penalty trial for talking about foreign gods, Paul is finding himself in that same kind of place. They're ushering him before this high council, and they're saying, tell us, what are you talking about? And there's even a little bit of a veiled threat there. So St. Paul, he is someone that has said in the scriptures, I will be all things to all men. So he finds himself in this heightened, civilized culture that is filled with idolatry, and he has to both proclaim the gospel, but also, in a sense, push away the charge that he's introducing foreign deities. So he's got a lot to do. And this is how he starts. He doesn't come at them saying, you guys are all crazy. He's probably thinking that inside. But he says, men of Athens. And that's a very Greek way of beginning. I see that in every respect, you are very religious. Do you see how he sees all around all these idols? Instead of just starting on a negative tone, he actually starts first with saying, let's find some common ground. I see at least that there's something in your heart that is trying to reach out and worship. Praise God for that. He's saying there's a common ground there. And that's a good lesson for us. When we are in the midst of our new pagan culture, this post-Christian culture, if you, in a sense, just charge at someone, you knock at their door, and you say, you're an idiot, repent, what are they going to do? They're going to be like, close the door, versus being able to find some common ground to, in a sense, lead with the relationship, to grow something there, so then that word can then be received. So St. Paul is not just trying to fight a battle, but he's knowing how to pick the battle so to win the war. And that's what we need to look at as well. And he's a perfect example because interiorly he's exasperated. He's frustrated. He wants to just wring their necks. And yet, he starts first with saying, let's start with what we have in common. You're reaching out. And in fact, this is the second part that's important, is he knows the culture and the history and the language of ancient Athens. Do we know the language, the culture that is pop culture? Do we merely just say, I'm just going to throw it over there, to heck with you all, and I'm just going to hang out in my citadel right over here? He is studying, he's learning. He actually quotes their own kind of pop culture voices in a sense. He knows their music in a sense. He knows their poetry. And that's how he's able to find a bridge to speak about the gospel. It's something for us to think about. Do we take time to try to understand what are the questions, the dreams, the concerns, the different things that are in the midst of our contemporary culture, even if they're broken? Christopher West, the wonderful author of so much and teacher on theology of the body, talks about the way that he came to understand the truth of John Paul II's beautiful teachings on human sexuality is the first sort of window into that, before he really was embracing Christianity, was through Bruce Springsteen and Bono from U2. And he talks about these different musicians. He calls them the twisted mystics, in which there's something that's true because they're trying to grapple with something, even though they get misguided, they go the wrong ways. But there's something there. There's this cry of the heart, even though sometimes it reaches out into hedonism or into materialism, but there's something there that is crying out. And he was able to, through that experience, through that window of these twisted mystics, that even though they were broken and looking in the wrong ways, it opened the door for him to find the truth and to realize that a lot of the rock and roll guys, they were in a sense reaching out, but they were grabbing a counterfeit thing. But there was still this desire behind it all that was still trying to reach out for that which is good, true, and beautiful. So we have to be careful not to just cancel out. We don't want to be cancel culture, people as well, but we have to be able to say, in every human heart, there is a desire, because our heart was built, even if it's shut down all the way down, for truth, goodness, and beauty. And the more that we can understand what are the things in culture that our youth and our different people are reaching out for and they're holding on to, it's important to study that, to understand that, and to say, what's here that could be a launching pad to bring the real feast instead of the paper feast that they might be feasting on, saying, why am I still hungry when I'm eating a paper steak instead of the real thing? So he looks around, he studies, he says, I've known as I look through this area, which is a forest of idols, but I find one of them that says, to an unknown God. And what's really beautiful about this is he understands even the history, because he quotes the one who says, in him we live and move and have our being. He is the poet that talks about this unknown God and says some of the history of that place of worship was that there was a great plague that was afflicting the people of Athens many centuries before. And they were reaching out to Zeus, they were reaching out to Poseidon, they were reaching out to Artemis, they were reaching out to all these different gods, and none of them were listening. They kept getting sicker and sicker. So then they're like, okay, all these guys seem not to care or have power to do anything. Maybe there's someone else out there. So in some ways, it also shows the parody of the Greek culture, where it's like, I'm going to just create an idol here and say, whoever else is out there, we'll just cover all the bases. So there's something that's misguided and broken in that. But St. Paul says, actually, there's also something beautiful, because it was actually that unknown God that they didn't have a name for that was actually the one who all of a sudden, after they reached out in that way, there was healing. And so they're like, we don't know who you are, but we're going to have this place here, and you're out there in mystery, but we want to try to reach out to you because you seem to be more powerful than all of these other gods. That's where St. Paul, he knows the culture, knows the history. That's where he starts. He says, you're reaching out. There was someone out there who seemed to be more powerful than all these other deities. That's who I've come to proclaim. So this is also St. Paul's way of saying, I'm not proclaiming any new foreign deity, but I'm actually proclaiming this very one that has rescued you, and you didn't know his name. And I've come to share that. So he finds the common ground. He finds the seed of the word, that area in all cultures that somehow has a little bit of the gospel, a shadow of the gospel. And he says, I trust that the Lord, when I start uncovering this, because it's linked to the truth, when I start uncovering that, it will start opening that culture to be more and more receptive to hear the whole truth. Because they'll sort of have a sense, that sense of like, I feel like I've heard this before. And then he's able to say, here is who he is. And in fact, he's not just one God among all of these other gods, but he is the very God who created the heavens and the earth. He created the wind, he created the seasons, he created the water, he created the sky. And he doesn't live in man-made shrines, and he isn't made out of stone or gold or all of these things, but he's the one that actually created all of it. So what St. Paul is doing here that's so beautiful is he's affirming the pagan culture, the Athenian culture's love of creation. They love creation, but the enemy has wounded them in such a way that they love it so much that then they start making a god out of creation. Instead of allowing creation to lead them to worship of the one true God who made it everything, they, in a sense, get stuck just in this world. And that's why they have the god of fire, the god of wind. All of these things are of this world. So no matter how powerful Zeus is, no matter how powerful all these other gods are, they're still stuck to creation. And that's why in their world, you have all these gods just sort of battling each other, and it's a whole mess. And so this is the power of St. Paul when he speaks to this culture. He has to, in a sense, lead them to what Judaism knew from the beginning, that there is one God, and all of these other gods are actually not gods at all, but that they're false. And in fact, by worshiping the one true God, the pagans then are led to discover the real goodness of creation. Instead of worshiping the creation, they're able to say, wow, God, you made all of this. And instead of, in a sense, stooping down in the image of man, then stooping down to worship things of gold, silver, wood, which is what the prophets of the Old Testament were also talking about. They talk about the gods of the pagans. They, in a sense, cut out part of a piece of wood, and they make a god out of that, and the god can't move himself, so they have to carry him around. And then they take the other part of the wood, and then they cook their food on it. They have a barbecue. And Isaiah the prophet is like, don't you guys see the craziness of this? You've, in a sense, taken the same matter. You've been the one that's carved it out. You carry that around and you worship that, and then the exact same part of that matter you cook your hot dogs on. But isn't it interesting, that idea of creating our own God is actually a very tempting thing? Because then you, in a sense, have power over it. You carry it where you want it to go, and ultimately becomes a worship of ourselves. We, in a sense, speak to ourselves saying, I'm beautiful, I'm perfect, I don't need to change, I don't need anything, because I tell this God exactly what to tell me. And so St. Paul is saying, Greeks, Athenians, there is actually a God who is above all creation. And even though he has given you this time of ignorance that you've been reaching and you haven't been finding him, even though there's something in your heart that's still reaching out, I've come to tell you the whole story, that it is this God who created everything. He is having a moment in which time will stop. That is really hard for a Greek culture to understand, because in Greek culture, everything is cyclic. It just goes over and over and over again. But Judaism, in which Christianity comes out of, there is a beginning and there is an end of time in which the Lord will judge the living and the dead. And this is where the radical part comes in here too, is St. Paul then says, and God has appointed a man, ultimately, who is going to be one in being with him, who will come to be that judge. And he is the one that has died, went down into the realm of the dead, and came back in the resurrection of his body. And it's at that moment that many of the Greeks who are hearing this gospel message, this kerygma, they start to laugh. Because in a Greek understanding, the body is merely a shell. What's really who you are is just soul. And so when you die, you, in a sense, just slough off your body, and it's like good riddance. It's more a prison in a sense. And so Christianity proclaims, actually, you are an embodied person. The goodness of creation. So remember how the pagans were affirming the goodness of creation, even though they were so misguided that they didn't even understand the goodness of their own body and saw it just as a shell to be thrown aside. Christianity comes in saying, the spark in your heart that's saying there's something good about creation, Christianity lives it out better. Because the Lord will take our bodies and glorify them and allow them to be with us in heaven. Our body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. And for many people in this gospel, they say, that's crazy. But notice how Paul doesn't back down from that. He finds common ground, but he doesn't just stay in common ground. That's the danger sometimes, to say, let's just try to find something that we agree with, and then let's not talk about the difficult stuff. St. Paul says, I have to preach the whole gospel. And so, Athenians, I'm telling you all these things that you have within your heart, but I'm also going to challenge you to say there are things in your culture, such as your understanding of the human body as merely a shell, that you have to let go of, just like you have to let go of these idols that you've been worshiping. And for some, that's too much. But isn't that what happened with Jesus too? Jesus preaches the full gospel, the mystery of the Eucharist. And many of his disciples walk away. So St. Paul is showing us that when we proclaim the gospel, when we evangelize, it means starting with common ground, finding ways in which to present the gospel in a language that culture can hear, but it will always be something in which that culture is never prepared for, is never ready. Just like the Jews of his time or the pagans of Athens, the gospel is always something that will push against us and be able to say, there is something more. But you have to be willing to die to this part of you in order to be able to experience everything that I have in store for you. The last thing that I want to mention here is one thing that this gospel also talks about is the Greek culture with all of these gods, and the original philosophers here, when they hear Paul talk about Jesus, they think of him as merely just one God among all the other gods. And so they were bringing him there to say, okay, if you prove that he's really someone that we should have here, then we'll have him as a statue too. And St. Paul, by saying this unknown God is not just one among others, but is actually above all and created all creation, reminds us that we have to be careful in our own way, even in our own way of living Christianity, because sometimes we can be like these Athenians who make Jesus one piece of the pie. Sometimes when I was a youth minister, I would say, okay, tell me about how do you spend your day? What are the important parts of your day? Where is God in the midst of it? And they're like, well, we have 30% for homework, we have 30% for eating, for playing video games. We do have, a chunk for God in there. And I say, well, that's great. But do you see the problem there? If he's one piece of the pie, then he's equal in dignity to everything else. Jesus Christ then becomes equal to video games. God should be the very crust on which every other piece of our life is founded. He's not merely just one piece. He's not one idol among all the other idols. Sometimes we live this as Christianity. Instead of this radical discipleship of saying, Lord, you have to be the Lord of my family life, of my work, of everything about me. My rest, my sleep, my play, my study, everything. You have to be the foundation. You have to be the crust of my entire existence. So let's not fall into the habit of the Athenians and just put Jesus as one duty among all the other duties of my life, but rather he has to be my all in all. And that's how we live Eucharistic revival.